Russian President Vladimir Putin said his meeting with President Trump in Alaska was, quote, timely and very useful. How is Putin using the opportunity to meet with the sitting U.S. president on U.S. soil to his advantage? We're joined now by Naveed Jamali, a former spy and intelligence officer. He's also the author of How to Catch a Russian Spy, the true story of an American civilian turned double agent, and now hosts Unconventional on Newsweek. Naveed, good to see you. You are a former spy. Help us get inside Putin's head here. How does his time in the KGB as a counterintelligence and foreign intelligence, how does that play into his goals during a meeting like this with the U.S. president?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand that for Russia, the Cold War never ended. Putin is a former KGB Soviet officer, and he thinks very much in that paradigm. So while we're talking about Ukraine, you think about to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was kicked off because the United States wanted to put missiles in Turkey and Italy, and the Russians and the Soviets responded by putting missiles in Cuba. So for Russia and for Vladimir Putin, he's always going to negotiate from a position of strength. So that Cuban Missile Crisis analogy, they look at Ukraine very much, it's completely unfounded, but they look at it as us encroaching in their sort of territorial area. So for Putin, he always wants to negotiate from that position of strength. And also, he is just incredibly distrustful, and I don't think he fully understands what our intentions are. And I think that perhaps is the problem here in kind of closing a deal.
You know, going into this summit Friday, it did seem the priority, at least from a European and Ukrainian perspective, was working toward a near-term ceasefire deal. But coming out of this summit, President Donald Trump seems to be posturing toward a lasting peace agreement, which some see as another opportunity for Putin to keep pushing into Ukraine. I wonder how you assess the dynamics that came out of this particular summit here.
Well, look, the pictures from when the two men met, I think that is a very telling sort of sign of how this is going. You had F-22s lining the runway. You had a B-2 and an F-35 fly over Putin. This is all, some might say that's bluster. Some might say that's stroking the president's ego. I would say actually it's sending a very clear message to Russia, right? Whenever you're negotiating with Russia, whether it's tariffs or whether it's Ukraine, you're negotiating with a nuclear-armed adversary. And the context of strategic deterrence plays into everything. The longer the war in Ukraine goes on, while the risk is not high, it's also not zero. The risk for escalation always remains. So I do agree with the president that a long-term solution has to be here. And look, when it comes to a successful compromise, usually the best compromise is when all the parties leave a little dissatisfied. And I think that's probably what's going to happen here. But at the end of the day, Omar, nuclear adversary, we have to understand that and respect that and know that that is very much part of the calculus here.
And, in the background of talks and meetings like this, there are obviously moving pieces along this deterrence through line. Coming into the summit, for example, we know President Trump ordered 2 U.S. Navy nuclear submarines to appropriate regions, as it was described, in response to some posts from Russia's former president and current deputy chairman of its Security Council. You're actually one of only a handful of people to film inside all 3 legs of America's nuclear triad, by land, sea, and air, as part of your Newsweek show, Unconventional. You were just on board a ballistic missile submarine in the Atlantic. What sticks out to you from those trips, and what sort of levers do you believe that dynamic brings to sensitive negotiations or meetings like some of what we just saw happen here?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, Omar, is people say we hope we never have to use those weapons, and that's absolutely true. But the reality is we use them every day for deterrence. We use them to make sure that Russia and China know that today is not the day for them to launch an attack, and tomorrow's not looking much better. When I was on the USS Wyoming, a ballistic missile submarine somewhere in the Atlantic, the thing that struck me is that right now that submarine is out there patrolling. And there are only 2 people in the world that know exactly where in the Atlantic Ocean it is, the captain and the navigator. The reason that is that if Russia or China or any adversary decided to attack us, they would never be able to take out those submarines. And that assures a second strike. It sounds very bleak, but honestly, these young women and men are committed to that mission, and that mission has done nothing short of separate the world from peace and catastrophe since the 1960s. And it's a mission that's going to continue on, and even as Putin and Donald Trump are negotiating, those submarines are patrolling. Putin understands that he is also negotiating with a nuclear adversary, and that absolutely comes in. The thing that struck me the most about the triad and covering the three legs is the young women and men who are absolutely committed to this mission. You know, I met a young airman in F.E. Warren Air Force Base, and one of the things when I asked him, I said, what do you think? He was 20 years old. What do you think of this enormous responsibility? He said, I worked really hard to get here. They're enormously proud of the mission that they're doing, and they literally, as we sit here, they're literally keeping the world safe.
You know, there's this moment that you brought it up already too, when Putin first arrived and President Trump greeted him on the tarmac. You know, you had this flyover of American military planes, including fighter jets, the B-2 stealth bomber as well. A lot of people online looking into it in a whole host of different ways. Oh, this was projecting strength. Oh, this was a veiled threat. Oh, this was to show off. I wonder, what did you make of that moment?
Everything is about posturing and communicating. It is telling the Russians that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is negotiating from a position of strength. We have a B-2 bomber. They do not. It's a capability that we have. They do not. And there's a very clear message, and I mean, the timing of it, flying it over in that precise moment, all of this, every single thing is messaging. When it comes to strategic weapons, so people understand that B-2 bomber is part of the nuclear triad. It is a nuclear-capable bomber. It is the one that avoided, detection to bomb Iran. It was designed to go into Russia. It is a clear message, Omar, and it is part of the position of the President of the United States trying to make sure that Vladimir Putin understands that we, too, are negotiating from a position of strength.
And, you know, we kind of breezed over it before in the intro, but I should just ask you, can you just tell us your story quickly about, you know, being a double agent, your intelligence work, and how it all ended in you being in the work you are here? I have to ask. We breezed through it.
Absolutely. Well, spoiler alert, I'm still here. I'm alive. I made it through. I spent 3 years working counterintelligence for the FBI against Russian military intelligence, the GRU, here in New York. And that was from 2005 to 2009, and when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, so everyone was watching the global war on terror. And what I can tell you, Omar, is from those days, what I realized is that Russia's posture, even the fall of the Soviet Union, it went from the KGB to the GRU. They were just as much, there was no change. So if you fast forward from 2005 to where 20 years later we are today, my experience is that the Russians still look at us as their primary adversary. We are the blocker for Vladimir Putin's desire to expand. And so they are going to do everything that they can to undermine us, to attack us without short of going to war. But yeah, I mean, look, when those Russian intelligence officers, who, by the way, are still operating today, a few blocks from where I'm sitting, when they step foot in the United States, they act as if they're behind enemy territory. And they're not wrong. And they were good. We just happened to be a little better.
Naveed, Jamali, appreciate you being here, the host of Newsweek's Unconventional. Thanks for taking the time.
You got it.